Why does criticism hurt so much? It's just words, right? Yet a single comment from a boss, a partner, or a stranger online can sit in your chest for days. It can make your stomach tighten, your face flush, and your mind replay the moment over and over. Let's slow this down. What's really happening when someone criticizes us? Why does our brain treat a few words as if we've just been punched? Here's the thing. Criticism isn't just social feedback. To the brain, it's a potential threat. And our brain has spent millions of years learning to protect us from threats of any kind, physical or social. When we hear criticism, even mild, the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, lights up. It's the same region that activates when we face danger. A 2016 fMRI study from the University of Michigan found that social rejection and physical pain share overlapping neural pathways, especially in the anterior cingulate cortex. That means our brain literally processes criticism like pain. Pain demands attention, so we focus on it. We replay it. We analyze every word. And because the brain hates uncertainty, it keeps trying to interpret what that criticism means for our safety, our identity, and our belonging. From an evolutionary point of view, this makes sense. For our ancestors, being disliked or rejected by the group could mean losing access to protection, food, or mates. So when someone today says, "You could have done better," our nervous system sometimes reacts as if our survival is on the line. But there's another layer, ego protection. Our ego, or self-concept, is the mental picture we hold of who we are. It's built slowly over years, shaped by our experiences, successes, and the feedback we choose to believe. When criticism doesn't fit that picture, the brain treats it as a mismatch, a kind of identity threat. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable tension when new information conflicts with what we already believe. If you think of yourself as a kind person and someone says you're selfish, your mind scrambles to protect its existing story. It might reject the comment outright, or it might ruminate, searching for evidence to prove the critic wrong. Either way, the goal is the same: protect the self-image. Neuroscientists have observed that when people receive ego-threatening feedback, brain activity increases in the default mode network, the same network involved in self-referential thinking and daydreaming. It's like the brain turns inward, circling around the wound, trying to patch the hole in the self. A 2018 study from Columbia University showed that people who received negative feedback about their personality traits experienced increased connectivity between the amygdala and the medial prefrontal cortex. That's the emotional center linking up with the self-processing center, an internal tug-of-war between emotion and reason. And here's the tricky part. Our brain isn't always fair about criticism. It tends to give more weight to negative feedback than positive. Psychologists call this the negativity bias. In experiments, participants remember criticism more vividly and for longer periods than praise, even when the ratio is 2-to-1 in favor of positive comments. It's like the mind has a built-in Velcro for negativity and Teflon for compliments. Imagine two coworkers. Both get annual reviews. One line praises their teamwork, another notes they sometimes miss deadlines. Which line will echo in their head on the drive home? That's the bias at work. So what can we do about it? Understanding the brain's reaction is the first step. When criticism stings, it's not proof that you're weak. It's proof that your brain is working exactly as designed. It's scanning for threats, protecting your sense of self, and trying to keep your social status intact. But we can train that system. We can teach the brain to respond rather than react. One simple way is psychological distancing. It's a strategy researchers at the University of Toronto have studied extensively. When you receive criticism, instead of thinking, "I failed," you reframe it as, "I'm noticing someone's opinion about my work." Quote, that mental shift moves the feedback from identity to information. And when the feedback becomes information, it loses much of its sting. Another technique is called self-compassion, a concept pioneered by Dr. Kristen Neff. Her research shows that people who practice self-compassion, treating themselves with the same kindness they'd offer a friend, recover from negative feedback faster. In one of her studies, participants who engaged in self-compassion exercises after receiving criticism showed lower cortisol levels and reduced heart rate reactivity. In other words, their bodies calmed down faster. Let's look at how this plays out in real life. Say you're a designer and your client sends back your work with a long list of changes. Your first instinct might be, "They hate it, I'm terrible at my job." That's the ego flaring up, protecting its image. But if you pause and say, "This feedback is about the project, not my worth," you create just enough distance for curiosity to step in. Now you can ask, "What can I learn from this?" instead of, "What's wrong with me?" Curiosity is the antidote to ego threat. It shifts the brain from defense to exploration. And when we're curious, the prefrontal cortex, the rational, forward-thinking part of the brain, reclaims control from the amygdala. There's also a social component. Criticism feels less painful when it comes from someone we trust. In a 2020 study published in Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience, participants receiving negative feedback from close friends showed less activation in the amygdala than when the same feedback came from strangers. Trust acts like a neural buffer. It signals safety even in disagreement. That's why healthy relationships can handle tough conversations. They've built enough psychological safety to absorb the impact. In workplaces, leaders who combine honesty with empathy create cultures where feedback becomes growth instead of threat. Google's Project Aristotle famously found that teams with high psychological safety outperformed others, even when their members were less experienced. The takeaway? Safety makes criticism constructive. But what about when the criticism isn't constructive? When it's unfair, vague, or simply mean? That's when understanding ego protection really matters. Because if we don't manage that instinct, we end up carrying someone else's emotional projection as our own truth. Here's a useful metaphor. Think of your ego as a smartphone case. Its job is to protect the device, your core self, from damage. A little protection is good. But if the case is too thick, you can't feel the phone anymore. You can't connect to the world. Overprotection becomes isolation. Criticism, when processed with awareness, helps us thin that case just enough. It keeps us open to growth without shattering our sense of self. Modern neuroscience also suggests that how we expect feedback shapes how we feel it. In one experiment at the University of California, participants were told they'd receive feedback on their social skills. Half were told the feedback would be negative, half positive. Those who expected negativity showed increased stress markers before any feedback arrived. Expectation itself changed physiology. That's the predictive brain at work. It's always guessing what's coming next. So if we walk through life expecting criticism to hurt, it will. But if we expect feedback as part of learning, the emotional sting starts to fade. There's a subtle brain chemistry side to this too. When we feel accepted, our brain releases oxytocin, the bonding hormone. When we feel criticized, oxytocin levels drop and stress hormones like cortisol rise. That hormonal shift affects everything from our mood to our digestion. It's why a single tense conversation can leave you feeling tired for hours. Over time, chronic criticism, especially in childhood or relationships, can actually reshape the nervous system. Children who grow up in highly critical households often develop heightened amygdala sensitivity. Their brains become wired to detect threat, even in neutral feedback. That pattern can persist into adulthood, making even gentle suggestions feel like attacks. But neuroplasticity works both ways. With practice, the brain can learn new interpretations. Mindfulness training, for example, has been shown to reduce amygdala reactivity and strengthen the prefrontal cortex. In an 8-week study at Harvard, participants who practiced mindfulness reported less emotional pain from criticism and showed measurable changes in brain structure, including increased gray matter density in areas linked to emotional regulation. It's not about becoming immune to criticism. It's about staying grounded in who you are so feedback becomes data, not danger. Think of elite athletes. They receive constant feedback, every movement analyzed, every mistake dissected. Yet the best ones don't crumble. They've trained their minds to separate self-worth from performance. They see criticism as calibration, not condemnation. That mindset can be learned. One way is through something psychologists call self-affirmation theory. When people reflect on core values, like kindness, creativity, or family, before receiving criticism, studies show they respond less defensively. It's as if reminding yourself who you are anchors you, so feedback can't knock you off balance. Another helpful trick is time. Immediately after receiving criticism, emotion floods the brain. But after about 20 minutes, cortisol levels start to drop. That's usually when logic returns. So instead of reacting instantly, take a breath, maybe a walk, and revisit the feedback later. The meaning often changes once your body calms down. Of course, not all criticism is useful. Sometimes people project their frustrations onto others. Learning to discern what belongs to you and what belongs to them is emotional intelligence 101. A good question to ask is, does this feedback align with evidence I trust? If multiple trusted sources mention the same issue, it's probably worth exploring. If it comes from one bitter voice, maybe not. What's fascinating is that the same circuits that process criticism also light up when we criticize ourselves. Self-criticism activates the amygdala and releases cortisol, just like external criticism does. That means our internal dialogue can hurt us as much as someone else's words. And since we talk to ourselves constantly, those micro-critiques add up. That's why building a supportive inner voice is so important. When you replace "I'm terrible" with "I'm learning," you're not lying to yourself, you're rewiring your brain for resilience. Every compassionate thought is like a small neural rehearsal for self-trust. Here's something powerful. In long-term studies on emotional well-being, people who handle criticism well tend to share one trait: psychological flexibility. They can hold two truths at once. This feedback is uncomfortable, and it might also help me grow. That flexibility keeps the ego from turning brittle. Imagine your ego as glass. When it's rigid, even a small crack can shatter it. When it's tempered, flexible, it bends and returns to shape. That's the goal. Not to eliminate ego, but to make it strong and soft at the same time. The next time criticism hits, notice what happens inside. Notice the heat in your body, the story in your mind. Pause. Name it, "That's my brain protecting me." That small act of awareness breaks the automatic loop. It gives you a choice. And choice is everything. Because while we can't control what people say, we can control how we interpret it. We can decide whether to armor up or open up. Remember, criticism is information filtered through someone else's lens. It's not a verdict on your worth. Even the most successful people in the world, artists, scientists, entrepreneurs, receive criticism daily. What sets them apart isn't immunity, it's interpretation. They've learned that feedback doesn't define them, it refines them. In neuroscience terms, that's the shift from threat mode to learning mode. The same situation, different meaning, different brain chemistry. So why does criticism hurt? Because your brain is trying to keep you safe. Because your ego is trying to keep you whole. But you're not powerless in that process. You can train your mind to meet criticism with curiosity, compassion, and clarity. If you found this exploration helpful, subscribe to Tortoise Brain for more calm, science-based insights into how the mind really works. Here's a final thought. Every time you handle criticism without collapsing, you're teaching your nervous system something new. You're proving that discomfort isn't danger. You're expanding the boundaries of who you believe yourself to be. And that, in a way, is the real purpose of criticism. Not to wound, but to wake us up to the parts of ourselves still learning how to stand tall, even when the world has something to say. Because when you understand the neuroscience of ego protection, you realize the pain of criticism isn't a flaw. It's a signal, a reminder that you care, that you're human, and that growth, like healing, often starts with a little bit of hurt. That's the hidden gift of criticism. It shows you where your ego is holding on too tightly and invites you to let go just enough to grow.